So we're going to talk us through the topic of skepticism and doubt, which some of you were in class for the very beginning of, most of you weren't. This is an interesting topic because it really does try and draw together lots of the threads from all of the other things that we've done. So you're going to see bits of rationalism and empiricism, stuff about perception, stuff about the definition of knowledge, stuff about Descartes. It's all in here basically. Okay. The topic's going to distinguish the sort of doubting that we do in ordinary life from what we're going to call philosophical kinds of doubt. So ordinary doubt and philosophical doubt. And essentially we're going to describe ordinary doubt as very kind of practical, real things like will the bus come on time and so on. And we'll consider a range of ways in which doubting can be done in a slightly more philosophical way, targeted at trying to achieve the right level of confidence that we might have in our knowledge. And at one extreme of this, we can find a guy called Pyrrho of Elis. Pyrrhonistic doubt or Pyrrhonistic skepticism goes all the way back to sort of early centuries BC. And Pyrrho was so convinced that we couldn't be sure of anything and that reason couldn't get us anywhere that he used to argue that you should just abandon hope of gaining any sort of knowledge about anything. It's a very pessimistic kind of doubt. Essentially, we just should give up doing things like philosophy because it's never going to get us anywhere. Much more constructively, modestly maybe, we also meet doubt in the person of Socrates, the teacher of Plato. And if you remember anything about Socrates as he appears in Plato's dialogues, you'll remember that Socrates is constantly challenging people, challenging the assumptions that they make, challenging the certainties and securities that they think they've got, and getting them to question things. And in Socrates, we see therefore doubt can be used as a very constructive tool because he doesn't want to leave people swimming around in that sea of doubt. He does want to knock out their complacent certainties and then move them forward using reason. So Socrates is very much trying to nurture a sense of intellectual humility in people. Once he said, all that I know is that I know nothing, which is a slightly paradoxical overstatement. But Socrates wants people to be more rational and to use reason to try and move forward in their understanding. But in order to get there, he thinks that a whole load of doubting needs to be done first to knock out the things that they complacently cling on to. And then the third kind of doubting we've seen so far in the course can be met in Descartes. And Descartes is a very interesting and extreme case as well. Descartes, as you know, wants to doubt everything that can possibly be doubted. But he's doing that for a reason. He's trying to clear the decks of everything that we can be uncertain of in order to try and rebuild the Tower of Knowledge in a more structured and certain way. So we call this methodological doubt. Doubt as part of a method of trying to regain certainty in our knowledge system. People talk about this as hyperbolic doubt because it's completely over the top. It's doubting absolutely everything, or global doubt for the same reason. It's indiscriminate. It targets absolutely everything. You may find yourself at some point having to do an exam question on this, and the classic sort of short answer exam question would be to contrast the sort of normal incredulity of our everyday doubting with this more philosophical kind of doubting. And the sorts of things that you would say, everyday doubting is very much local, specific. Will the chair hold my weight? Will this cake poison me? And it's the sort of things that would have practical consequences. Therefore, if I doubt the chair will take my weight, I won't sit on it. If I doubt that the cake is safe, I won't eat it. However, it is sensitive to evidence. If I then eat the cake and I don't die, then my doubt has been overturned. And the essence of all of this is that this is a real kind of doubt. If I don't sit on a chair, it's because I really doubt that it will take my weight. If you contrast that with the more philosophical approaches to doubting, that we can highlight the fact that philosophical doubting isn't really practical. If I doubt that there really is a chair or that there really is a cake in some abstract way that doesn't actually stop me eating it or sitting on the chair. And it's not a doubt that is really responsive to those sorts of evidences. So I eat the cake and I think, well, there still may have been no cake. This is because it's firstly a global kind of doubt. It takes in absolutely everything. It is indiscriminate. And it's a hypothetical kind of a doubt. I'm not really seriously doubting these things. I'm just doing it as sort of an academic exercise. Right, so there's 3 or 4 things that you can say to neatly contrast everyday doubting and philosophical doubt. If we're writing an essay on this, then we're going to need a neat definition. So this is the one that you need to learn. Philosophical skepticism is defined in the syllabus as the view that our normal justifications for knowledge are inadequate. Okay, normal justifications for knowledge. What that isn't saying is that we have no knowledge at all. Okay, that would be a strange thing. You know, Socrates, when he says all that I know is that I know nothing, is sort of slightly contradicting himself. And much more significantly, it's not saying that all of our beliefs are false. You can be a philosophical skeptic and accept that all of our normal justifications for knowledge are inadequate. But that doesn't mean that lots of the things I believe aren't true. It's perfectly feasible that lots of the things that I believe happen to be true. I might be able to doubt them and question them, but they may still be true. Okay, so that's philosophical skepticism. Now, when we talk about the normal justifications of our knowledge being inadequate, what do we mean by that? There are 2 things that you know from our previous study provide our normal justifications for knowledge, and those are experience and reason. If you're an empiricist, you think that all of our knowledge needs to get justified by experience. And if you're a rationalist, you think that some of our knowledge, at least, can be justified by reason. So that's sort of classic paradigm cases of knowledge through experience. David Hume talks about the table. Knowledge through reason. People like Plato and Descartes and Leibniz get very excited by maths. Both of those normal justifications for knowledge can be questioned in various ways. A classic way of questioning the knowledge that may come through experience would be the hypothesis that we could be a brain in a vat, as modern philosophers talk about it. If I were a brain in a vat in a computer laboratory strung up to a supercomputer by loads of wires, I could be made to experience the world exactly as I do now. So all of these experiences could be fabricated, much as in films like The Matrix. So I can't trust my experiences at all because they could all be cooked up in a lab. What about reason? Is that immune from this kind of skepticism? Well, no, not really. If you think about how we achieve knowledge through reason, it's by using the deductive process. Deductive reasoning starts from particular premises and then uses logic to reach particular conclusions. Setting to one side for a moment how we know that the laws of logic work, let's just settle on the premises. If I'm going to reason to a conclusion, I need to assume certain premises are true. But then how do I know that the premises are true? Either that has to come from experience, or it too has to come from reason. So this leads us to a problem that we call the problem of infinite regress. This problem sort of presumes the JTB definition of knowledge, which we met a long time ago, that knowledge is true beliefs brought about by justifications. And here's how it goes. If I want to claim that I know a particular belief, B, it needs to be true, and I need to be able to justify my conviction that it's true. And this will require an argument based on certain premises. So let's call that J1, justification 1. However, it presumed the premises that it uses also need to be confirmed, and that will require a different argument, justification 2, which uses different premises. But then those premises also need to be justified, and that gets me justification 3, and another set of premises, and so on. And you can't just go backwards forever, it just doesn't work. So that's the problem of infinite regress. And so on that basis, we can say that our normal justification from experience is unsound because of the brain in the vat scenario. Our normal justifications from reason are unsound because of the problem of infinite regress. Which brings us to Descartes. And Descartes manages to sort of sweep in all of this stuff. He addresses experience and he addresses reason. The three steps of Descartes' doubting do very particular jobs, and it's important we remember the particular jobs that they do. Step one, which was to draw attention to illusions and the deception of our senses, is focused on local doubt. It's pointing out that our senses can play tricks on us. They're not always reliable. But that doesn't mean that they're always playing a trick. And actually, there are times when I can cross-check things pretty carefully and be pretty convinced that they're probably not playing a trick. So to deal with experience, Descartes realized he needed to go beyond illusions and sense deception. And that's why he brings in dreams. This absolutely tackles the knowledge from experience problem, because you can't be sure you're not dreaming now. That said, Descartes does point out that if I'm going to dream I'm flying on a pink unicorn, then the idea of flying and pink and unicorn must have come from somewhere. And that suggests that there are things in a real world from which they could come. But even more importantly, remember, Descartes holds that the truths of maths and geometry are still valid in dreams. You may disagree, but Descartes thinks that in a dream 2 + 2 still equals 4. And that is the reason why he brings in the evil demon. It's not to deal with the experience bit, it's to deal with the reason bit. Because the point of the evil demon is that he can make our reason play tricks on us. He can deceive us into thinking that 2 + 3 = 5 when it doesn't, or that a square has 4 sides when it doesn't. And it's only the evil demon, therefore, that gets us to this global or hyperbolic level of doubt. Bear in mind what Descartes is trying to do here. He isn't going to try and leave you in a state of sort of Pyrrhonistic despair that philosophy isn't worth it. He certainly doesn't want you stuck in a deep, dark hole of solipsism. Neither is this simply an exercise in Socratic humility. Descartes actually has a much more positive end in view. He wants to rebuild the Tower of Knowledge and to build it solidly. Remember, he ultimately wants to be a scientist and be able to chop up animals and build this new structure of scientific knowledge that the Enlightenment is so passionate about. So this is a methodological skepticism. He is going to try and build a solid, rational foundation for all of the new science, so that we can be utterly confident that these beliefs are certain and are reliable. We know broadly how he does that. Step one is going to be to try and find something which is so self-evident that it can be the foundation of the whole tower. And his foundational building block is his own existence. I think, therefore I am. In other words, his own existence is so self-evident, it cannot possibly be doubted. It cannot logically be doubted. It would almost be self-contradictory to do so. So that is step one, I think. And once I've got my own thoughts, he thinks from the raw material of my own thoughts, I can get as far as God. My thoughts include such things as the idea of infinity, the idea of perfection, and so on. And from these, as you know, through the trademark and ontological arguments, he thinks he can get to God. And if there is a good, perfect, rational, moral God, then I can be sure there isn't an evil demon, because God won't allow me to be deceived in such a systematic way. If there isn't an evil demon, I can be sure that there is a world that's real, and even more importantly, a world that is rational. Because only if the world is real and rational can I then go about doing all the science I want to do. And be convinced that it's telling me how the world really is. Absolutely key to this whole strategy is Descartes' concept of clear and distinct ideas, what he calls rational intuitions. There are certain things which I can clearly and distinctly see must be true. In this, he includes my idea of the self. This is a clear and distinct idea I cannot possibly doubt. Ideas of infinity and perfection. Remember, he thinks the causal principle is self-evident, that something cannot be brought about except by something greater than itself. And the whole problem with all of this approach of clear and distinct ideas is that the evil demon is going to stuff it up right and proper. Because the evil demon can make something seem rational when it isn't rational. That's the whole point. So why can he not make something seem clear and distinct when it really isn't clear and distinct? So if we take our approach to Descartes in this way, we've said Descartes' rationalist response to skepticism is problematic. Number one, because the evil demon, once he's out of the box, infects absolutely everything. Number two, there is a circularity in Descartes' reasoning. He uses God to convince us we can trust our clear and distinct ideas, because God, of course, wouldn't allow them to deceive us. But then he also uses clear and distinct ideas of infinity and perfection to prove that there must be a God. That is absolutely a circular argument. We know that we can raise questions about whether building block number one is sound. Is the cogito even self-evident? David Hume questions whether there really is an enduring self. When we introspect, all we encounter is a bundle of sensations and thoughts, not a self that is having them. And as we'll see later, there are people who will question whether this whole strategy of total doubt is even a plausible or possible scenario. Isn't there a self-contradictoriness in Descartes trying to persuade us to adopt the strategy of doubt when he's relying on reasons and logic and so on to do the skeptical reasoning in the first place? You can't reason at all if total doubt is in play. So it's almost an impossible thing to do. Most importantly of all, I think, and this is going to lead us on into all of the following elements of this, it can be claimed that Descartes has set the bar for knowledge stupidly high. If you think back to topic number one, when we were looking at the definition of knowledge, remember that Descartes' approach to knowledge was described as an infallibilist approach. In other words, you can only say you know something if you know it infallibly, if you cannot possibly doubt it. But actually, we're going to see lots of people question that. And David Hume puts it really nicely. Cartesian doubt, he says, if someone could attain to it, as plainly no one could, would be entirely uncurable, and no reasoning could ever bring us to be confident about anything else. There's two important points in there. First of all, well, the second half of that sentence, Cartesian doubt is uncurable. No reasoning could give us confidence about anything. In other words, if you allow that Descartes has got us down as far as the hole, then we're not getting out of it. You never can, and all of Descartes' strategies fail. But the first part of the sentence makes the point that we should never have let ourselves get stuck in the hole in the first place. If they're Cartesian doubt, if someone could attain to it, as plainly no one could. And what he's saying is, nobody can doubt that much. It's just not possible. This quote from David Hume points us towards a very different approach to this question of philosophical skepticism, taken by pretty much all of the empiricists. First of all, though, just to note that the empiricists are coming at this from exactly the same perspective as Descartes. If you remember, at this period in time, pretty much everybody was an indirect realist. That means Descartes, Locke, Hume, Russell, all of them think that we don't encounter the real world directly. but that the real world is concealed behind a veil of perception, what we call sense data or impressions. And once you've put this veil of perception between ourselves and the world, then you have to accept that we can't have certainty about the existence of an external world. The sense data might be caused by that, or they might be caused by something else, or they may even just be cooked up inside our head. So Descartes, from that point, wants to say we have to sort of prove our way to a real world beyond the veil of perception. The empiricists are going to take a different approach. And they're all going to accept, first of all, they're going to concede that we can't have certainty about the existence of an external world. Nonetheless, they're going to say, we can have sufficiently well-founded belief or opinion for getting on with ordinary life. And all of them are going to suggest that Descartes has made a mistake by setting the bar for knowledge as high as he has. That his infallibilist approach, which requires knowledge to be beyond all possible doubt, is just too ridiculously demanding. So let's just start with John Locke here. Locke thinks that the only thing I can be absolutely certain of is what's going on inside my own head. My own thoughts and my own experiences are direct, and therefore they're certain. I can know for sure that I'm thinking about ice cream. However, because my knowledge of the external world is indirect, it comes via the veil of perception, it must of course be uncertain. But notice that doesn't stop him calling it knowledge, because for Locke, knowledge doesn't require certainty. Also, just remember that Locke is a little bit subtle in terms of what we can know about the external world. He thinks that we can know about its primary qualities, its size and shape, etc. Because these things we can all measure and we all get the same number. But we can't know for sure about its secondary qualities, because those are subjective. And we can't know anything terribly much about the matter of which the external world is constituted. We can't peel away the veil of perception to see what kind of stuff is behind it. So the matter of the external world remains for Locke a something I know not what. So there's a mixture there of affirmations of knowledge. He knows that there is a world, even though he can't be certain. He knows what kind of shape and size that world is, but also an acceptance of some room for doubt and skepticism based on the subjectivity of my experience and the veil of perception being in the way. How is it that I can know there is an external world? Remember the things that Locke said. He thinks we've got a very good reason to think this, because firstly, our experiences are involuntary. I can't just make them happen. Unlike my dreams, I can't make my dreams happen. And my experiences of the real world are consistent. They all agree with each other. So my sight and smell and touch and so on, they all tell the same story. And on that basis, he thinks there's good reason to think there really is an external world causing these experiences. Of course, that doesn't knock out the possibility of the evil demon causing them. It doesn't knock out the possibility of God causing them. Locke just doesn't think these are terribly serious candidates. You might remember that Bertrand Russell takes a slightly more sophisticated approach. He absolutely agrees with Locke that we can't be sure there's an external world, we can't prove it. But he's going to approach this problem abductively. He's going to sketch out what the rival hypotheses are. It could be cooked up inside my head. It could be an evil demon. It could be God. It could be a brain in a vat and a super scientist. Or it could be actual tables and chairs causing my experiences. And he's going to say which of these hypotheses is the most economic and sensible. In other words, which of them is the simplest, least messy, that's Occam's razor, and which of them is closest to my intuitions of common sense. He says you shouldn't allow yourself to get dragged into complexity without good reason. Never multiply entities without necessity. But also you shouldn't let yourself get dragged away from normal intuitive common sense without good reason. And in his view, there is no good reason to get dragged away from the most economic and sensible hypothesis, being that there are actual tables and chairs causing my experiences. David Hume, as you know, takes a slightly more skeptical frame of mind on lots of things. He does concede that there are a number of things that we like to think we can be confident about, but we can't really. In this respect, he's a little bit like Socrates, picking away at our complacencies and false certainties. So, for example, he points out that our concept of the self is a little bit suspect. When we introspect, all we see is a bundle of sensations and impressions and ideas and thoughts, never a self. Our concepts of God and matter are very problematic. We don't have experiences of those things. Our concepts of causation and morality, he thinks, are rooted in experience, but they don't necessarily mean what we think they mean. I won't go back through all of that again, but hopefully you can go look it up. And just remember, he also thinks that the principle of induction is a little bit suspect because we can't establish that one in any a priori way or from experience either. He thinks the only possible justification for the principle of induction is that it's always worked before, so we should probably expect it to keep working. But of course, that uses the principle of induction to establish itself, which is another circular argument, so you can't have that. But the point about all of these doubtings that Hume tries to sort of point out to us, these areas of possible doubt, is again, rather like Socrates, these are all local. He is pointing out that we can't be sure of or certain of particular things that we tend to be rather falsely certain of. He's not conceding to Descartes' global doubt. And there is a reason why I think Hume says that we can't go there. And his main reason is simply that psychologically it's impossible to us. In reality, psychologically, we may not be able to ditch the idea of the self or the idea of causation or the principle of induction either. We just can't make ourselves think differently to that. But much more fundamentally, we can't think that there isn't an external world. We can't be a solipsist. It's just not psychologically possible. This is another great quote from Hume, which summarizes much of what I've just said. The great subverter of excessive skepticism is action, practical projects, the occupations of everyday life. Skeptical principles may flourish and triumph in the philosophy lecture room, where it is indeed hard, if not impossible, to refute them. But as soon as they come out of the shadows, are confronted by the real things that our beliefs and emotions are addressed to, and thereby come into conflict with the more powerful principles of our nature, skeptical principles vanish like the smoke and leave the most determined skeptic in the same believing condition as other mortals. So in other words, all of this sort of Descartes-ish skeptical doubting, brain in a vat stuff, he says is pretty much irrefutable if you're sat in a lecture theatre asking yourself, could I be this? But in reality, nobody takes it seriously. And as soon as you walk out the door and start, eating your bun and, riding your bike, nobody is thinking that these things are not real. We just can't help ourselves. So empiricism ends up being a pretty strong supporter of the common sense view that we can know that there's an external world and that it is much like we think it is. And notice how it does this. It lowers the bar on what should count as knowledge. where Descartes was an infallibilist, requiring knowledge to be beyond all possible doubt. The empiricists are all slightly giving way on that and saying that we simply can't realistically doubt these things, and therefore we should acknowledge that they should count as knowledge, even though in theory we could doubt them. In reality, we can't. The third person on this list of supporters of common sense might surprise you. It's George Berkeley. And Berkeley will surprise you as a potential supporter of common sense unless your memory is very good. Because what you know about Berkeley is, first of all, that he doesn't think there's a material world at all. The only reality that exists is the reality of ideas. And these ideas are held together in the mind of God. It's God that makes the world coherent and consistent for us. But there is no separate world of matter beyond the world of our experience. What you need to remember is that as far as Berkeley is concerned, this isn't some sort of silly wacko theory. He says of his own view that no object of common sense is lost. He thinks he's defending common sense. He doesn't think he's a skeptic. And that's because the target of his arguments is people like John Locke, who think that there is a veil of perception behind which a strange world of matter, a something we know not what, exists. And that things like colours and sounds are only subjective, and the real world out there has no such thing. It's just particles vibrating away and bumping into each other. In other words, the real world is nothing like you think it is. It's not colourful, it's not noisy, etc. Berkeley wants to say the exact opposite. The real world is just like you think it is. The real world is the world of your experience. The real world is colourful and noisy, and so on. And what he's really getting at here is that when you talk about tables and chairs and so on, when you talk about the world, what you're referring to is the tables and chairs of your experience as you experience them. When you talk about the world, you're talking about the world of your experience as you experience it. This is the world for us, the world of our ideas. Now, you can argue against Berkeley's overall theory that he is, excessively reliant on God and maybe his proofs don't work. But there is an interesting thing lurking around in Berkeley's view. And it's resurrected in the mid-20th century by a philosopher called Hilary Putnam, who wrote an interesting article on why he was not a brain in a vat. And Putnam's argument is really quite simple. He says, when I talk about brains, my idea of brains has come from my experience of normally pictures or TV programs with brains in them. When I talk about vats, my idea of vats has come from my experience of vats. That's what the language is about. It's about the stuff of my world of experience. And if that's what a brain is, and if that's what a vat is, then I can be pretty confident I'm not a brain in a vat. All right, you've got to sort of think a bit to get your head around that. But he's basically saying that when you think about what the words brain and vat refer to, and they refer to the things of my experience, I'm not that, straightforwardly. Another way of essentially supporting common sense would actually be to unpick the common assumption of all of the preceding theories. They all suggest that our direct experiences of some mental object, sense data, and that either behind that there is an external world, in the case of Descartes and Locke and so on, or behind that there is no external world, in the case of Berkeley. But in every case, my direct experience is a mental one, a mental object. We, of course, explored an alternative theory, which is the direct realist view. And the direct realist view ditches this veil of perception entirely. It says what I'm experiencing directly is the real world, the material world. And if that's the case, they can be completely sure that that there is such a material world. Now, whether or not you are an indirect realist or a direct realist, I'm not completely convinced that direct realism does solve the problem. Because for this argument to work, we would need to be able to be completely sure that the brain in a vat scenario is impossible, that there could be no artificial way of stimulating my brain so as to create an experience this vivid and this consistent. We think we have some evidence that that might be the case. We know, for example, that when our brain does things like memory or dreaming or imagination or hallucinating, rather different bits of the brain are busy than when my brain is directly seeing the world. But that might not be enough to persuade me that the brain in a vat scenario is completely impossible and that an experience this vivid and consistent couldn't be created by stimulating my brain with electrodes. A rather more interesting and plausible defense of common sense picks up the thread from Hilary Putnam about language, takes it in a slightly different way. In the early 20th century, we saw in philosophy what's often called the linguistic turn, or the turn towards language. In other words, instead of our attention being focused on reason or experience in some abstract sense, our attention became focused on language and the way in which language processes our experience and enables our reason. So it becomes the linchpin of everything. And the key driver of this all the way through the 20th century in multiple waves of stuff was Ludwig Wittgenstein. And here we've got a really simple point to make. Wittgenstein's argument is that language doesn't drop from the sky in some sort of mega dictionary of God or some such thing. Words mean what humans use them to mean. There isn't some sort of immaculate, perfect definition of the word knowledge that we must all defer to. The word knowledge means whatever humans use it to mean. Now, Descartes, of course, tells us that we should use the word knowledge to refer to things we can know infallibly with beyond any possible doubt. He takes what Zagzebski calls a prescriptive definition of knowledge. This is what it should mean. This is how you should use it. Wittgenstein notices that this isn't the way most people use it. He says that language should be understood and defined descriptively. You should look at the way people actually use the word knowledge in their day-to-day life, and that is its meaning. On that basis, we use the word knowledge rather a lot, and we use it without it having to clear Descartes' rather absurd infallibilist bar. It's just stupid to say I can't know I'm holding a pen, or I can't know I'm looking at a computer. People say they know these things all the time, so that's what the word knowledge must be defined to mean. Okay, so that certainly drops the bar from where Descartes placed it. Another rather interesting development in 20th century philosophy was a return to the approach of common sense, which we can see in the 17th century by sort of rather minority figures like Thomas Reid. But in the mid-20th century, G.E. Moore argued for a common sense approach to things. And his thinking goes this way. Descartes tries to persuade you that you should doubt everything. And in persuading you, he's using the tools of reason to try and persuade you. And there's something just self-contradictory about that. Cartesian doubt can't explain anything, can't say anything coherent, because it sort of dissolves itself with this uber-skepticism. In reality, he says, deductive reasoning, Descartes' right to say that deductive reasoning must begin from certain premises, which are taken for granted. but Moore says that the obvious place to start is with the things that none of us can realistically doubt. Let's say that we accept the existence of the external world as a premise, because none of us can realistically doubt that. And so we build the Tower of Knowledge up from there. His argument is that the assumptions of common sense logic and of perception are so basic to our lives, so central to the whole way that our belief system and our language system works. There is absolutely no point trying to doubt them because you just can't. So let that become the start point for our reasoning. Let's put that at the base of our Tower of Knowledge and let's build upwards from there. This takes us the furthest off the syllabus, so you can sort of bracket it out if you like, but I do love not just his name, Willard Van Orman Quine. What's not to love about that name? I do also love the way that he gets us to think. Quine also questions this notion from Descartes that the building of our system of knowledge should be a bit like building a Jenga tower. First of all, we trash everything. And then we build from the very basic building block upwards, trying to find really solid first beliefs and then work up. And he says, this just isn't the way we do things. This isn't the way in which humans do think rationally and refine and progress their systems of belief. He said it would be a bit like being in the middle of the ocean in a leaky boat and thinking, oh dear, we need to fix the boat. Let's take all the planks off and start, building again from the base. Well, that really would not get you very far because, you've got to keep moving, you've got to keep sailing. And he says it's a bit like that with knowledge. Nobody takes their whole knowledge system apart in this kind of a way because we've got to keep living. What we actually do is refine things progressively. If you were sailing across the ocean in a boat, and you saw that there was a leak, you would try and find where the leak was, you'd find the weakest point in the boat, and you'd swap out that plank very quickly. And this is how we do things also with our knowledge system. He says it's helpful to think of your knowledge or belief system as rather like a web. Every belief and concept and idea is connected to lots of other ones. Some of them, they reinforce each other. There are some that are very central on which the whole thing holds together, rather like the keel of the boat. And there are others that are a bit more peripheral. We always take more care before we swap out the ones that are near the center because it's going to take much harder work to rebuild the thing when that's done. So what we do is we look for where the weaknesses are. We look for inconsistencies between beliefs. We look for failures to match up between beliefs and experiences. And where we can find those failures, we try and fix them. We try and modify things to put the web back together again. And we do this through the whole of our life. So Descartes' just wrong. We don't do bottom-up rebuilding of belief systems. We do progressive tweaking of belief systems. We tweak them whenever the beliefs aren't consistent or coherent with each other or a fit with our experience. And to the extent that they are, we are more rational people. So on this basis, there is absolutely no good reason at all to ditch the core belief that there is a real world out there. And on that basis, no good reason to think that I am a brain in a vat. Finally, and sort of coming back home to this key thing that I've been saying all along, we need to think about our definition of knowledge here. What do we mean by this? Descartes said that knowledge is defined infallibly. Knowledge is anything that can be believed beyond possible doubt. Implicit in this is the JTB definition of knowledge, that knowledge is a true belief which requires a justification. But maybe it's not. Maybe actually knowledge is something else. We explored a number of theories back in the early parts of the course, but let's just consider one of them now, the reliabilist theory. On this basis, knowledge is a true belief brought about by a reliable process. This is one version of this we can find in Alvin Goldman. This is what we call causal reliabilism. And that just requires that my beliefs are true beliefs, which are caused by a linking chain back to the truth. So I know that there's a dinosaur because I have a true belief, and that true belief is caused by TV programs, which are researched by teachers, which are taught by scientists, who were taught by archaeologists or sort of paleontologists who actually dug up bones which were laid down by actual dinosaurs. So there's a chain back to the dinosaur. And similarly, my belief that there is an external world, as long as there is a causal link back to the external world, well, that's good enough. I don't even need to know that it's there or be sure that it's there. It doesn't matter. As long as the link is there, that counts as knowledge. And similarly with the more mainstream version of reliabilism, which says that knowledge is a true belief brought about by a process which has a good track record of producing true beliefs. In other words, anything such as deductive logic or sense perception or scientific method, inductive reasoning, trial and error, studying and being taught by experts, etc. These things generally produce solid, sound beliefs that work. On this basis, anything that is produced in this kind of a way can be called knowledge. So the nervous schoolboy has knowledge because he's done all of his revision really well and been taught by a the Iron Age farmer has knowledge because his tribe have practiced many, many generations of trial and error to settle on this point to farm. They don't have to be able to justify it. This is what knowledge is. And on this basis, I can claim to have knowledge, again, that there is a real external world. I don't have to be certain of it. That's not what knowledge is. The bar has been lowered from where Descartes placed it. But picking up Wittgenstein's point, this is descriptively matches the way we use the word. There's also a link back to that common sense school, which says, look, you can't build castles of knowledge in the air. You've got to start from somewhere. You must have a ground zero basic assumption on which the building will rest. And so let's just accept that we've got to start from the things which we all agree on, which are there is an external world out there, and that our sense experience is broadly reliable and logic basically seems to work. So let's start from there. If you try and hack even deeper down below that, then really the whole thing comes tumbling down irretrievably. So to conclude, we started off by distinguishing between ordinary doubting and philosophical doubting or philosophical skepticism, and pointing out that there was a number of weird features of this Descartesian philosophical doubting. First of all, it sweeps up absolutely everything. It's quite indiscriminate, unlike our normal everyday doubting. That's because it has a methodological goal to it, which is to sweep everything off the desk and allow us to rebuild the Jenga tower one brick at a time. One objection is nobody thinks that way. It's not healthy or good or even plausible to do so. This kind of doubt is hyperbolic. It's over the top, unlike the way we normally doubt. And it's hypothetical. It's not real. It's not what we actually do in our, take seriously in our lives. Some of the responses to the challenge of this hold to that view that we can be certain we're not a brain in a vat, and we can be certain philosophical skepticism is wrong. Descartes thinks we can prove our way out of it. Berkeley thinks that because all there is ideas and we can be sure of God, we can be sure of our ideas. So that's that. And the direct realist vanishes away the veil of perception, and again thinks that we're directly encountering reality, so no problem. Probably the more plausible solutions to this solve it by dropping the bar on what counts as knowledge. The empiricists, the ordinary language people, the common sense people, coherentists and reliabilists, They all agree that certainty is impossible, but they all think this really doesn't matter. What we actually mean by the word knowledge doesn't rely on certainty. The way we use the word doesn't involve certainty. And whilst in an abstract sense, we might be able to think we're a brain in a vat or about the reality of the world, none of us psychologically are actually able to do this. It just can't be done. Wrap back to our start point, we distinguish ordinary doubt from philosophical doubt. Ordinary doubting is a jolly good thing, very healthy. You should do lots of it to test out whether your beliefs are sensible and rational or not. And there's nothing incompatible with believing things and going through that process of doubt or wondering. You can believe in God and still have doubts about God. In fact, that's probably a fairly healthy kind of mental state to be in if you're a religious person. On the one hand, we talked about Pyrrhonistic doubt, and that's possibly a much too pessimistic endpoint to conclude this topic, because it implies there's no point asking questions about ethics or politics or philosophy or perception or mind or any of this stuff, because it's all just too difficult and unsolvable. Well, I think we can do better than that. At the other extreme, we have Descartes, and Descartes thinks that we should doubt absolutely everything, but very bombastically thinks we can retrieve it all as well. Probably too extreme in his doubting, and certainly too extreme in his confidence in reason. So rather like the three bears, it may be that Socrates had it just about right. We should use doubt, we should use it constructively to prune away at the weaknesses in our beliefs, at the assumptions and complacencies that we have. And through doing so, we should try and work ourselves towards such truth that we're capable of finding, and hopeful that there is truth out there to be found. And that's it.